Hi, I'm Mark Brumley. It is my honor to introduce Joseph Pearce. Joseph is among my favorite writers. He's a superb literary biographer with books on Chesterton and Tolkien and Belloc and Lewis and Oscar Wilde and Solzhenitsyn, and a little-known playwright and poet, Shakespeare, among others. Joseph Pearce is, as they say, a go-to. In this case, he's a go-to when it comes to a Catholic take on literature. In fact, he literally wrote the book, which is called Literature, What Every Catholic Should Know. Today, he's speaking on the topic of Ignatius Critical Editions, a series of literary classics that Joseph edits. He is also the inspiration, the motivation, the energy behind the project. The Ignatius Critical Editions are outstanding works with superb essays and insightful introductions and helpful annotations, all aimed at providing a tradition-oriented approach to literature as opposed to a modernist or postmodernist approach. I could say more on the subject, but why have me talk about it when you've got Joseph Pearce? So I encourage people with questions to present those in the chat. And I'm going to turn over the virtual floor now to Mr. Joseph Pearce.
Well, thank you so much, Mark Brumley, for that introduction. It's good to know that you like me. I feel vindicated. I'm going to speak. The focus of my talk ultimately is going to be honing in on the Ignatius Critical Editions, but I'm going to, if you like, frame that discussion by talking about why do we need critical editions, and I'm going to frame that discussion by talking why do we need to read the great works of literature. Why is it so important? And the key reason it is crucial is that they continue to teach and show unchanging truths in times of change. And in that sense, we can actually say that the great books save us from slavery. It was G.K. Chesterton who said that the Catholic Church saves us from the ignominy of being children of our own age. And that's the key thing. Throughout the whole of history, there are two spirits that we can follow. And in every generation, the temptation is there to follow one or the other. In German, it would be the Heilige Geist or the Zeitgeist. In other words, the Holy Spirit or the Spirit of the age. And it's always tempting to follow the Spirit of the age because we think in every generation that that's winning, right? By definition, the Spirit of the age is the age which is in the ascendant. It's the age which has the power. It's the age which is fashionable. It's the age which all the people who are in, that's the spirit that they follow, the spirit of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. And on the other hand, those who follow the Holy Spirit, in other words, those who are trying to be saints instead of wallowing in sin, tend to be A, in the minority, and B, relatively powerless, which is one of the reasons that the Salve Regina refers to this world in which we find ourselves as a valley of tears. I actually prefer to use the old English type version of it, vale of tears, because the word veil, V-A-L-E, can become a double entendre for V-E-I-L, a vale of tears, because in this life we see through a glass darkly, we see through a veil, and it's a veil of suffering, it's a veil of sorrow, it's a veil of tears. So as well as being a valley of tears, it's also a veil of tears in that other sense. And that's because the spirit of the world is always worldly. and that's something we need to bear in mind. This is true of all generations. In actual fact, I'm currently writing a book, which is a history of the world. The title of it is The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful. A history in three dimensions, those three dimensions being the good, the bad, and the beautiful. The good is a desire to be holy. Those who are either saints or trying to be saints. The bad are those who are not trying to be saints, who are following their pride and their selfishness. And the beautiful are the great works of art, the great works of literature, which sustain us in every generation. And it was Pope Benedict that said, ultimately, the only argument for the Catholic Church are the saints that she's produced in her womb and the great works of literature that she's inspired. The great works of art, the great works of beauty, not just literature, visual arts, music, etc. So those who follow the spirit of the age are unable to think outside the box, often an ideological box. The current ideological box is the box of woke that nobody had heard of until about 10 years ago. But whatever it is, and I'm going to go through that in a moment, is that what the church does is allow us to see things from the perspective of two things. Eternity, which is the most important way of seeing things, seeing things as God sees them, as far as that's possible, and it's only possible through the teaching of the church, but also to see things telescopically, to see the whole of history as a landscape presented to us. And of course, you have to have a knowledge of history to do that. And one of the ways we get to that knowledge of history, of course, is the great books that speak from those times from a perennial perspective. But I want to look at the spirit of the age briefly before we get into the great books and then the Ignatius Critical Editions. Because the spirit of the age, if many people think, well, of course, the truth is whatever is new, right? The fads and fashions. And as C.S. Lewis said, fashions are always coming and going, but mostly going. So I want to go through the last few hundred years. We could do this for every century since the time of Christ. But I'm going to start in the 17th century. In both England and the United States, in the 17th century, the prevailing spirit of the age was Puritanism. And, that was what most people were or were expected to be. And people were persecuted if they were not Puritans, whether it be Catholics, whether it be the king. In the case of Charles I, he was beheaded after the Puritans seized power after the English Civil War. Puritanism, now, if someone were to follow that particular spirit of the age, that which was all the rage in the 17th century, they would now be seen to be somewhat weird. Following century, the spirit of revolution, the 18th century, the French Revolution. Again, this is a revolution which hates the church, which invents a weapon of mass destruction to kill civilians, the guillotine, and brings in this utopia, actually brings in the Great Terror, the Reign of Terror. And it collapses in on itself. And what comes from this revolution is, in fact, militaristic imperialism in the form of Napoleon and Napoleonic Wars. So, in France at that time, you were with the revolution or you were going to be killed. The people of the Vendée in France who stood up against the revolution were killed in what can really only be called a genocide by the tens of thousands, by the French revolutionary government, and want to wipe them out. And what was their crime? Staying true to the truths of the Catholic Church in an age of madness that seemed to be the sanity of the age. Let's go to the 19th century. In 1897, Queen Victoria celebrated, or the nation of Britain, the British Empire, celebrated the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria, 60 years on the throne. In 1897, the British Empire was triumphant. It ruled the world. Almost 1/3 of the land area on a map of the world was pink, which was the colour denoted the British Empire. Queen Victoria was not just the Queen of England or the Queen of the United Kingdom. She was the Empress of India. And again, to be British in the 19th century was to support the empire, to believe that the British were the best, and to use the evidence of the empire to prove that Britain was the best. That was 1897. Britain ruled the world. By 1997, that was certainly not the case. Indeed, by 1917, it was not the case. By the end of World War I, 1918. So, within 30 years, actually within 20 years of this golden jubilee of British triumphalism, the empire was falling apart. As for the 20th century, the spirit of the age was one of totalitarianism, communism in Russia and China, Nazism in Germany, fascism in Italy. This, where basically we have an absolutism, where the secular power is the God. And what was the consequence of that? Tens of millions of people butchered. So the 20th century characterized by two things: an age of totalitarianism, where governments destroyed their own people, and an age of world war. World War I, World War II, the bloodiest and most deadly century in human history. So let no one tell you that the world is progressing, unless it means progressing downwards. So here you see, what I've done here is show you four different spirits of the age: Puritanism, French Revolution, British Empire, totalitarianism, covering 4 centuries, all of which have passed away. Well, worldliness manifests itself in other ways, similar or otherwise to that. So the great books of literature free us from the spirit of the age. They show us the shallowness of it. And that's why I want to talk to you about the Ignatius Critical Editions and why they are necessary. Because the great works of literature show us perennial truths outside the box of any particular zeitgeist, show us the truths that do not change from century to century. That there's only 2 ways that those who follow the spirit of the age can respond. They can either ignore those great works, and of course, in many of the high schools and colleges of this country, that's exactly what is happening. The great books of Western civilization are being cast aside, a sort of book burning, because they're out of fashion with the spirit of the age and the woke culture. But the other way that the great books are undermined, or efforts are made to destroy their power to convey truth across generations, is through perversion. You either ignore the great books or you pervert the great books. And it was actually my response to the latter, to the perversion of the great books, that led to the idea of starting the Ignatius Critical Edition. So let me explain. Some time back, about 15 years ago, when I was on the faculty of Ave Maria University in Florida, I was teaching a course on Romanticism, literature course on Romanticism. And amongst the works we would be studying would be Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And when I got the desk copies, the editions of the work I was going to set for my students, I was horrified by the queer theory, radical relativism, Marxism, anti-Christianity, all of the isms of the zeitgeist, to explain away, to pervert the true meaning of those 2 works, Frankenstein and Wuthering Heights. And I thought to myself, why am I patronizing these pernicious, poisonous editions of the great works? Because not only am I buying a copy, but of course I'm making my students buy copies, and also putting it in my students' hands, this poison. So Father Fezio, who's the president or the founder of Ignatius Press, was also at Ave Maria at the time. And so I broached with him the idea of beginning the Ignatius Critical Editions. And another reason, by the way, I should mention before we come to that, is Shakespeare abuse. You know, I grew up with William Shakespeare as the greatest writer ever. And the way that Shakespeare is misread, misconstrued, perverted by the modern academy to pursue agendas which are completely counter to what his plays and poems actually say is scandalous. So this Shakespeare abuse was something that I also wanted to address in the Ignatius Critical Editions. So I went to Father Fezzi. I said, we need to produce critical editions of the great works of literature, so that the tradition-oriented scholars, whether it be at a college or high school or homeschooling parents, have an option, have a choice not to buy into the poison, not to contribute to the problem, but to become part of the solution. So, not surprisingly, the first three of the Ignatius Critical Editions were editions of Frankenstein, Wuthering Heights, and a Shakespeare play, King Lear. And for a time, basically every third title that we produced about has been a Shakespeare title. So I think we've now, I've lost track of the actual numbers, but I think it's something like 27 titles so far. We're still producing more. But 27 of the great works of literature are in the Ignatius Critical Editions, 7 of which are actually Shakespeare plays. So if I can remember which ones they are now: Merchant of Venice, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear, and Julius Caesar. So they're the ones that are already available. I mean, my idea would be, my plan, my dream would be that, 15 years from now, we have 100 books in the Ignatius Critical Edition series, not 27, and that would include all of Shakespeare's plays. Either way, what we've done already is very good. So what are the Ignatius Critical Editions? Because you might be wondering. And well, first of all, let's go back. But what's a critical edition? Right, a critical edition of a work is a work that contains the whole text of the work itself in its entirety. But it also has footnotes to the text, annotations that explain. And so much poison, by the way, seeps into these secularist texts of the great books through the poisoning of the meaning in the footnotes. I could give all sorts of examples, but let me give you one from Shakespeare. That Shakespeare talks about the life we owe. And that is normally glossed in footnotes in secular editions as owe equals own. Now you think about the difference of meaning. Do we own our lives or do we owe our lives? Is there a difference? Of course there is. If we owned our lives, we would not give them up. All of us are going to have to give our life up, whether we like it or not. The Anglo-Saxons talked about our life being leased. We have a leasehold, and we don't even know how long the lease is, because it could end tomorrow. So we don't own our lives. And Shakespeare knows that, and all of his plays show that. So when Shakespeare says, "Oh, life is owed," he means life is owed. But they change it to own, all of a sudden now we're our own God, right? We own our lives, we can do what we like with it, rather than owing it as a debt and as a gift. Just one example. So in the Ignatius Critical Editions, we have tradition-oriented scholars annotating the text to make sure that it's the meaning that the author of the work intended that's there, and not the spirit of the age that's poisoning that meaning. In addition, a critical edition would have an introduction by an academic, by a scholar, by an expert on that particular work, and also a selection of critical essays looking at various aspects of the work. And so that's what the Ignatius Critical Edition is really following the pattern of the Norton Critical Editions, which again, full of the poison. The same thing. So let me just show you here. This is the first one in that first batch of 3. The edition of King Lear with a beautiful work of art. They all look like this with that gold bar, black. It's a very, very nicely done series. But if I open it up, The Tragedy of King Lear with Classic and Contemporary Criticisms, edited by Joseph Pearce. I'm series editor of the whole series of the Ignatius Critical Editions, but I've also edited individual titles, those titles that I know better, and I've edited all of the Shakespeare ones. So we have an introduction, in this particular case by R.V. Young, and those of you that maybe know, he's a great scholar, good, solid Catholic scholar of literature. He wrote the introduction, and then we have classic criticism, where we have the text, the whole text of the play with those footnotes. Then we have classic criticism. So in this case, we have, in other words, criticism from healthier times that wasn't poisoning the work. So we have John Keats and Samuel Johnson and A.C. Bradley amongst the classic criticism. And then a contemporary criticism. In this particular edition, we have 6 essays by contemporary scholars, one by yours truly and other scholars. Okay, so, and then for most of the editions, this might be a particular practical use for homeschooling parents, that most of them come with a study guide. So this is a study guide for King Lear. And, you know, so even if you, because I know that parents can feel intimidated, right? If you have no background in literature, that a writer like Shakespeare, Shakespearean English, can be intimidating. When your children get a bit older and they're getting to high school level, and these texts might seem beyond you. Well, this is an example of how we try to help. Because in this study guide, why a great book study guide in going through the table of contents? So what's the reason for it? How to use this guide, so a practical way how to use it. And then the first section is the context. In other words, when the play was written, who was Shakespeare, what's happening at the time, all the backdrop, the realistic backdrop to the age in which it was written. And then comes the bare bones, the skeleton plot, where you just go through scene by scene, very briefly, so you can see just in a few pages the whole plot of the play. And then we have words made flesh, summary of the critical appraisals and study questions. So this will be, again, just a very brief summary of the essays, the critical essays in there. So you can just see them, without having to read them all, you get what they're saying, cutting to the chase, so to speak. And then there's a section, things to think about while reading the play. Let me just actually turn to that one, just to give you some idea. This is obviously the one for King Lear. And we have things to think about while reading the play. It says at the beginning, the questions posed in this section are not intended for examination purposes, but are designed to prompt appropriate trains of thought for the student to ponder as he reads the work. Questions intended for examination purposes are to be found in the study questions on the text at the end of the study guide, so a bit further on. We'll get there in a moment. So here, things to think about reading the play. There are 8 things to think about. I'm going to read just a couple of the shorter ones because it could take too long to read the longer ones. So the second one here, in one sense, Lear is a play about growing old and all that it implies. Man's mortality and the fact of transitions, one age passing and another taking its place. With regard to the elderly, how does a man let go of life? When he does, if he can, how does he handle problems of inheritance? How does he handle preferences? Should there be any preferences? How does one face such questions as these in the light of Christian injunctions to love all, even enemies? Let's do one more. 5, be alert to motifs having to do with sight or seeing, and the question of who sees clearly and who does not. Keep in mind that all great tragedies turn on moments of insight, of recognition. Be able to identify all those who have tragic moments of recognition in the play. All right, so just some examples. Then we get study questions on the text of King Lear. So there are two types of questions. And again, imagine now you want to get your son or daughter to engage with this particular play, King Lear by Shakespeare, not one of the easiest, but arguably the best. So the first one, part one, knowledge of the text. Again, without getting too philosophical, Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas teach us that we can only get to the truth through the senses. In other words, we have to know the facts before we can actually understand what's behind the facts, so to speak. So if you don't understand what's happening on the literal level of a story, you won't understand what's happening on the literary, allegorical understanding of the story. So very simple questions. Knowledge of the text. Who are King Lear's three daughters? Who in Act 2, Scene 2 is put in the stocks? Lear's removal of his clothes in Act 3, Scene 4 reminds us of which saint? Which religious order does Edgar invoke implicitly at Act 3, Scene 4? And the first four questions of 15. Study questions on the knowledge of the text. Now, part two is essay questions. And this is important because basically, imagine you as a parent don't particularly know King Lear. You're not particularly trained in literature. It's going to be difficult to oversee your son's or daughter's engagement and to certainly to do it yourself, so to speak. Well, here, however, you could test them with the 15 questions from the text. And then part two, essay questions. Here we actually supply 10 essay questions. You are presumably only going to give your son or daughter one. And the idea about this is that these essay questions are pitched, maybe at lower down, maybe even possibly, if your kids are bright, middle school level, right up to college level. But you as the parent have 10 to choose from. You know your own child better than anybody else. And you can make the decision as to which of those 10 essay questions is most appropriate for your own child to get to grips with. So I'll just read a couple here. The first one, very simple. How does Edmund turn his father against Edgar and why? And the next one, the exchanges between the Fool and Lear are pregnant with meaning. Take two examples and examine the poignant meaning beyond the seeming foolishness. Maybe just one more. Oh, let's read that one maybe. The reconciliation between Lear and Cordelia at Dover is one of the most touching, heartrending scenes in all literature. Lear describes himself as being upon a wheel of fire. His madness and his being stripped of all the pomp of power have given him a new humility, and with it qualities of openness and self-questioning that are new to him. Read this passage closely and then describe Lear's conversion from the character we see at the start of the play into the character who emerges at the end. What does this tell us about Shakespeare's approach to the drama? Okay, so just 3 examples of the 10 given there. And you might be thinking, because I would be thinking if I was in your shoes, well, that's fine, but how do I grade? How do I actually assign a grade for this once I've said it? Who's going to grade it for me? Well, there is actually an answer key at the back of each one, which is perforated so that it's detachable. So the parent can take this away and just give the remainder to the child. So the part 1 study questions. In fact, let's just answer the first. I think I asked the first 3, did I? First 4, I think I asked. So let's answer them. Who are King Lear's 3 daughters? Answer, Regan, Goneril, and Cordelia. Who in Act 2, Scene 2 is put in the stocks? Answer, Kent. 3, Lear's removal of his clothes in Act 3, Scene 4 reminds us of which saint? Answer, St. Francis of Assisi. Question 4, which religious order does Edgar invoke implicitly in Act 3, Scene 4? Answer, the Franciscans. Okay, so you've got the answers here. You can actually test your your child, your student, with those 15 questions, and you have all the answers. What about the essay questions, however? So I can't remember which questions are asked now, but actually the part of essay questions, you're given guidance as to what sort of things the students should have been talking about. So I think the first one, how does Edmund turn his father against Edgar and why? Whereas the how requires a simple summary of this part of the plot, the why should look at the motives for Edmund's actions, which might include feelings of resentment and anger, but also the embrace of Machiavellian principles of political philosophy. And then the second one, the exchanges between the fool and Lear are pregnant with meaning. Take two examples and examine the poignant meaning beyond the seeming foolishness, and the guidance for the parent to be seeing whether these elements are in the essay. The essay should show an understanding of the allegorical aspect of the fool's role, giving illustrations of reason in madness, in the wisdom that emerges in the apparent foolishness of the fool's words. The essay should also address the limits of the fool's wisdom, i.e., its worldliness and pragmatism, and its benign Machiavellianism, as distinct from the malevolent Machiavellianism of Edmund. Was there one other I gave? Can't remember now. Oh, yes, I think it was Reconciliation 8. Let's read that one as well. The reconciliation between Lear and Cordelia at Dover is one of the most touching, heart-rending scenes in all literature. Lear describes himself as being upon a wheel of fire. His madness and his being stripped of all the pomp of power have given him a new humility, and with it qualities of openness and self-questioning that are new to him. Read this passage, 4:7, closely, and then describe Lear's conversion from the character we see at the start of the play into the character who emerges at the end. What does this tell us about Shakespeare's approach to the drama? And this is the elements that the parents should be looking for in the student's paper. The essay should be centered on an engagement with the 32 lines to which the question refers. It should also compare what is being said in these lines with citations from earlier in the play, employing a compare and contrast approach. Having analyzed the meaning inherent in these lines, the essay should culminate with a discussion of the conclusions that can be drawn about Shakespeare's own approach to the writing of the play that can be deduced from these lines. Okay, so some examples here of the study guides that come with them. So I won't go through and list them all. I'm going to conclude in a moment with a reiteration of why it's important that I'm sure many people that come to a homeschooling conference don't need to be told this, but there's nothing wrong with buttressing what's already there. And for those that do need to know, then it's important that you do know about why your children, your students should be learning this. But basically, in the Ignatius Critical Editions now, in 27 titles we have so far, the earliest are Augustine's Confessions. And again, we have great experts. Father Macconi, great Jesuit. St. Louis is the editor of that. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy in a brand new translation from the Latin. And then, Shakespeare's, I've already listed the 7 Shakespeare plays. We have Jane Austen is greatly represented because she's just brilliant and should be. So I think we have 3 of her novels so far, second only to Shakespeare in representation, and that is Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Mansfield Park. We have some Dickens, of course, Great Expectations, A Tale of Two Cities, are the 2 I think we have so far. We have American literature, so The Scarlet Letter, Moby Dick, The Red Badge of Courage, and I know I'm forgetting the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We have Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. We have Bram Stoker's Frankenstein. We have obviously Mary Shelley's. So you have Bram Stoker's Dracula. We have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We have 2 of the Bronte sisters' novels. Wuthering Heights, I mentioned already, and Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte, and I'm sure I'm missing some. So basically, you could almost already structure your high school literature. Why do they even say almost? You could structure your high school literature program for your children on what's already available. Get the editions, get the study guides, and you're good to go. Everything from, as I said, from Augustine and Boethius, right through to the end of the 19th century with Oscar Wilde and the Red Badge of Courage. So it's there for you. It's been provided especially for you. I mean, I've given you the motive, why this series was started, to protect students from the poison of the spirit of the age. Your students should not be reading any other editions of the great works than the Ignatius Critical Editions, if that particular one is available. Of course, there are many more than 27 great books. Okay, so I'm going to conclude now, last 10 minutes or so, with a reiteration of why all of this is important. I wrote something fairly recently on Einstein, and Einstein basically saying that teaching science alone is inadequate, that science does not make a fully human person. Einstein, amongst other things, of course, played the violin very well. He basically says that we need the humanities because the humanities teach us about humanity. So if we don't actually teach our children the humanities, so theology, philosophy, history, literature, they will not be fully human. They will not understand the fullness of reality, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Now, the great philosophers from Plato and Aristotle, right through St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, tell us these are the most important things. The good, the true, and the beautiful is a manifestation of the Holy Trinity. Now, when Jesus Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he is saying, I am the good, the true, and the beautiful. So if an education is not about the good, the true, and the beautiful, but about the useful, how to get a job, how to be profitable for the global corporations, how to be a cog in the machine, how human do we need to be the cog in the machine? How human do we need to be to get to heaven? So the humanities teach us about humanity. The humanities also teach us to love our neighbor, and love the Lord thy God and love thy neighbor. Two absolute, non-negotiable commandments. One thing about the woke people is they hate everybody, not just hate everybody who disagrees with them, and they clearly do, but they hate everybody who lived in the past. Basically, the whole past, you can turn your supercilious nose at because we are superior to them. We are not full of their prejudices. We know better than them. It's the teenage kid who thinks he knows better than his grandfather. So what the humanities teach us, not just to love our neighbor who lives next door in space, but our neighbor who lives next door in time. In other words, we need to love our neighbors who are still unborn. We need to pass on to the future generations the gifts, the glories that we've received in the tradition of Western civilization. That is to love our neighbor, to love the unborn neighbor, so that he's not born into a desert, but into a place which is full of life. But also to love our neighbors who live in the past. And that's, again, the great books take us into the past. They take us into the genius of the past. And if we spend time with Homer and Virgil and Dante and Chaucer and Shakespeare and Jane Austen and Charles Dickens, to name but a few, we will very quickly realize that these men and women are not inferior to the woke people but they actually are much deeper in their understanding of the cosmos, in their understanding of who they are as human persons, and their understanding of their neighbor. So the humanities teach us about humanity. They teach us to love our neighbor in time and in space. As Chesterton said, that tradition is the extension of tradition is the democracy of the dead. It's the extension of the franchise. It's the proxy of the dead and the enfranchisement of the unborn. Think about that as a definition of tradition. Basically, it's the proxy of the dead. It's bringing them into the conversation. It's letting them have a vote. It's letting 3,000 years of Western civilization have a voice in the discussion of where we happen to be in our very transient moment in time and space. But it's also the enfranchisement of the unborn. It's giving to future generations this priceless inheritance of the great works of Western civilization. So as Chesterton said, and to reiterate, the Catholic Church saves us from the ignominy of being slaves of our own time. It allows us to see our own time from the perspective of all time and of that which is beyond time, from eternity itself. And as the church has always taught, and as recent popes such as St. John Paul II has taught, the church also insists upon the sacred marriage of fides et ratio, of faith and reason. The church is the beautiful bride of Christ. And as Chesterton says, the church is like a heavenly chariot, careering through the ages, reeling but erect. In other words, that this inheritance we're talking about of Western civilization, the church is the bearer of that inheritance through the ages, which, by the way, is why she's hated so much by secularists in every age. The woke generation now, but the French Revolution, the Nazis, the communists, secularists in every generation. Because she's the truth bearer through time, a heavenly chariot, reeling but erect. In every generation, it looks as if the church is about to topple over. It's reeling from side to side, being attacked. It's on rocky terrain. And yet it never does career over. We have 2,000 years of proof of that. So to come back to what I said at the beginning, to read the great books is to be living with unchanging truths in times of change. In this way, the great books can save us from slavery. Because you mustn't forget, slavery is not just a thing of the past. Slavery that was, the slavery that is, in other words, having no freedom, and the slavery that is to come, we can be saved from that if we cling to the inheritance of Western civilization. So read the great books. Buy the Ignatius Critical Editions, because you have nothing to lose except your chains. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joseph. That was fantastic. As in typical form, I might add. No surprise. So we really appreciate your time, of course. Now, we had a few questions that have already come in. Certain reflections on what you had to say, as a matter of fact. So I'll read those just to kind of prime the pump, if you will. It sounds like all good scholarship and great instructional help to have those essays included. What a great resource. I'm eager to learn more about the catalog of available titles. Someone said, all very eye-opening, the culture of death can lurk even in the footnotes. I now consider myself better armed in my ability to protect my children. Thank you for the information, and thank you for these important additions. Bethany says, I co-taught a high school British lit class for our co-op this past year. I wish I had known about these. They sound amazing. I'm grateful to know about it now and for the next time we teach it. Thank you. Julian asks, what are your thoughts on giving younger children abridged versions of the classics? before reading the works in their entirety?
Great question. I'm going to step one back, because I think I might have heard a question embedded in one of those comments. If people want to know more about the Ignatius Critical Editions, by the way, and thank you, because I should have given this information in the talk. If you remember, this is simple, ignatiuscriticaleditions.com. And if that's too much to write in the URL line, ignatiuscriticaleditions.com, then go to ignatius.com and then search for Ignatius Critical Editions. Either path works. Okay, what do I think about giving younger children abridged versions of the great works? It's a it's a difficult question, because what abridged version are you using? All right. Again, the devil can be in the detail. If it's an abridged version, which is in keeping with the spirit of the original work, and it's for younger children, if you like to whet their appetite, then I have no objection to that whatsoever. But a great work of literature is great, and sometimes you have to be mature enough to get to it. So, you don't give your 5-year-old a glass of red wine. You might give your 15-year-old a glass of red wine. So the same thing, right? It may well be that Shakespeare, Charles Lamb stories. I have no real objection to Charles Lamb stories, but I do think it's important for us to know. Let me give an example, however, of my doing something similar, but it's with music. There's a book that I bought years ago called The Wagner Stories by someone called Philson Young, that tells stories like fairy stories about the plots for Wagner's operas, which are, of course, rooted in Norse mythology and in Germanic folklore and fairy stories. That's a perfect way of introducing your children to music. My only concern is that if the abridged version, what's it leaving out? What's it emphasizing? No, so I think that really the only informed response to that question is, do you as a parent know the work that's being abridged? If you know it well enough, read the abridged version, and if it seems to encapsulate the spirit of the work, go ahead for younger children. But read it first, because if the poison is in the detail, as in the footnotes, the poison can also be in the abridgment, right? What's left out, what's stressed. If it's an abridgment, it's extra lines put in that aren't even in the original, that sort of spin what's happening. So it's about being informed, and that's all I can really say. I can't give an answer that's going to be very cut and dried, because it's not quite that simple.
So Jacqueline asks, I had little exposure and education on the great books and often feel overwhelmed. I'm with you, Jacqueline, by the way. That was not my background. My oldest is 11. What order would you suggest doing them?
Okay, that's a great question. And really, I should probably write about that and haven't done. So thank you for exposing a raw nerve and a sin of omission on my part. As regards Shakespeare, that's easier, I think. Shakespeare, you should begin with, I think, certainly for girls, Romeo and Juliet, and for boys, for both girls and boys, Romeo and Juliet. And very important, and I would even suggest, and I'm not just trying to sell my own products here, I wrote a book called Shakespeare on Love, Discovering the Hidden Meaning of Romeo and Juliet. When Shakespeare wrote that book, when Shakespeare wrote that play, he was the father of a 13-year-old daughter. He deliberately makes Juliet 3 years younger than she is in the poem that was the inspiration, to, if you like, accentuate the fact that a girl, having reached puberty, is vulnerable. And so that's the way you have to read Romeo and Juliet. And that's the way, by the way, it's approached in the Ignatius Critical Edition of it. But Romeo and Juliet's necessary reading for adolescents. So I don't know to what extent any middle schooler is going to be up to Shakespeare. I mean, some are. I mean, I've met 9-year-olds who have read The Lord of the Rings 4 times. But, they're the exceptions, right? But certainly, by the freshman year of high school, they should be introduced to Shakespeare. And I would say the 2 first books of Shakespeare they should be introduced to are Romeo and Juliet and Julius Caesar, both of which are available in the Ignatius Critical Editions. As regards other works, it's too big a question to answer here, but I should write about it. So thank you for the prompting of that.
So I have a question of my own. And again, I would invite everyone to ask their questions in the chat as they come to you. But with the track of modern sensitivities, the things that you alluded to, what do you see as the future of the classics? I mean, do you see them in peril? You hear about it, right? They're being removed from schools, universities, never talked about, or at the very least, like you described, they're skewed in such a way that they're not even remotely close to what maybe the original author intended. So what do you think the future has in store for them?
Well, I mean, the worst case scenario, the worst case scenario is the devil wins, but we know that's not a realistic scenario. So the worst case realistic scenario is that the great books, like the rest of us, will be forced into the catacombs. It's happened before, not just in the early church, but it happened in Russia 100 years ago. The church is in the catacombs. It happened in Eastern Europe after World War II. The church is in the catacombs. It's still the case in China today. It's still the case in large parts of the Middle East today. That the church is in the catacombs. In England, in my own country, for 300 years, the church was in the catacombs. For 150 years, it was in the catacombs, punishable by death to be a Catholic or a priest, and another 150 years of softer persecution. So the worst case scenario is that we have to pass on the torch of this great inheritance to future generations in a climate, in a culture which despises it. And that would just put us basically in brotherhood with so many of our Christian brothers and sisters in the past, and no doubt in the future. And I said, the worst case scenario, that might not necessarily be the worst case scenario. Now, our Lord says, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. We shouldn't be looking for the path of least resistance or to keep ourselves in our comfort zones. It may well be that the church needs to be purified through a period of persecution. But the best case scenario, of course, is that through the work of good, solid education, good, solid evangelization, that we can bring our culture back from the brink of the abyss and once again build on the foundations that are already there before they're completely and utterly cast away. So they're the two parameters. I'm happy with either, and I'm happy with either for two reasons. One, because these great works are immortal. They can't be destroyed. They contain the truth. And B, God is in his heaven. And C, the end of the world is when I die, which is not that far from now. And my eyes are on the finishing line. And then I go to something which is beyond this vale of tears. Deo gratias.
Sounds great. Thank you for that. That's great. So Maureen asks, what are your thoughts on racial epithets used in the classics, such as in Huck Finn?
Well, I actually wrote about it. The best thing I could say about that is that if you go to the Imaginative Conservative and put in Huckleberry Finn and Pearce, you'll probably get my full argument to it. Basically, my position is that certain words that are absolutely offensive now were not meant that way when they were written. There were people that would use certain words in a way, and I use examples such as the word nice. It's an N word, by the way, so you can see it as an analogy, if you like, as a euphemism for the other N word. But the word nice now means something which is good. In Chaucer's time, it meant something which was nasty. In fact, the modern English word necious comes from the same root as the modern word nice. And if you said to Chaucer, "Have a nice day," he'd punch you on the nose. And by Shakespeare's time, the word nice meant, as in the modern understanding of the word nicety, as in fastidiousness, not actually a good thing. So when Portia talks about nice distinctions, she's talking about something which is not nice at all, right? So we have to understand the meaning of words change, and the way that the other N words are used 100 years ago by Mark Twain and others are not being used the way they'd be used by a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And the same thing, if a rap artist in today's culture uses the N word about a black person, it seems a compliment. Who's saying it, when, and why? That's called intelligent discourse. Banning books or banning words or rewriting books because there are words in it which we find offensive is the beginning of the banning a book tends to the burning of books, and the burning of books tends to the burning of people. It's to be avoided.
You know, it reminds me of, for those moms who have read Frindle by Andrew Clements, you'll know what I'm referring to when they changed the meaning of the word or the definition of pin to Frindle. So it reminds me of that a little bit. So I digress. So Colleen asks, do you have suggestions for how to evaluate critical editions for books that Ignatius isn't currently publishing?
Okay, well, there aren't any good critical editions for books that don't trust any critical editions except for the Ignatius Critical Editions. That's the bottom line there. But that doesn't mean, of course, your children should not be reading the other books that aren't in that list. Of course, that would be scandalous to suggest otherwise. But I would suggest in that case you buy the cheap editions, Signet or what have you, that really just have the bare text. And very little perversion going on through input beyond it. So, yeah, if you can't get the Ignatius Critical Editions, just buy the most basic edition, just has the text of the work without any commentary.
You touched on this a little bit, but I'll ask it in case someone didn't catch it. But what is a non-English great work that you would like to add to this collection?
You mean there isn't any great work that's not English? Well, I mean, yeah, there's so many. I mean, obviously, to this collection. Well, the problem with non-English works, this collection, you have the question of translation, right? And if a translation is in copyright, quite frankly, it's excruciatingly expensive to publish a translation if it's in copyright. There might be good translations that are out of copyright. We've looked into that. But, you know, so for instance, our edition of Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, we're very blessed to have a new original translation. So we have the Confessions of St. Augustine again, but, you know, it's a question of translation. There are, of course, numerous great works that are not English, but the translation is an issue, and, you know, because you have to pay for them.
So Lindsay asks, besides these great critical editions, are there other books, classes, Joseph, that's a key word, classes, you know I'm going with that, you would recommend for high school age children or even myself to aid us in critically thinking about any books that we read?
Thank you for the cue, Walter. Well, obviously, I do hope that the people attending this conference are aware of Homeschool Connections, because I know we use it. We have a 13-year-old daughter, and she uses Homeschool Connections, so I practice what I preach here. The Homeschool Connections allows you to have your children taught by reliable, solid Catholic teachers, and you can choose either to take the live course or you can take the recorded course, right? Or a selection of both. So, I absolutely suggest that you check out Homeschool Connections to have a reliable way of giving your children a good, solid education from home.
And to that, I would only add to that Joseph is one of those teachers. So, and a critical component of that. I must admit, as a quick anecdote, as we take a moment, I look forward towards the end, but I'll just share this with you. I remember when I reached out to you, colleague, was it 7, 8, 9 years ago, something like that? I said, Joseph, I'd really like for you to teach a class with Homeschool Connections. Are you interested? Sure, I'd be happy to sell my books for you guys. So that was your original response. And then we kept working on you. And now here you are. So,
well, I would say actually it's been nothing but an unmitigated blessing for me. And, you know, have been teaching for you, I think it probably is for 7 or so years. And I've taught many, many courses, and it's a joy. And I feel blessed and honored to be part of the Homeschool Connections family.
And I couldn't agree more. We feel blessed to have you part of it. So, but more importantly, I would say, you know, these Ignatius Critical Editions, take them up, gobble them up. I included the link earlier about, you know, how to access them from the exhibitor page. So I would go to that page. I'll see if I can put it in there again. I think it's still in my cache. It sure is. There you go. It's still there. So take a look at the link there, and there's mention of the Ignatius Critical Editions as well. Gina's asking, are there bundle prices if we want to buy several of the editions? Do you know that? Do you know?
Well, that would be a question for Ignatius Press, and unfortunately, I don't think Mark Bromley is still with us, but he would be the person to answer that question. I would suggest you actually write to Ignatius Press suggesting that, because that's a great idea, and I think it makes sense that we make it easier for homeschooling parents to buy Ignatius Editions in bulk. So I'm completely in favor of that idea, and I think you need to voice it with the publisher. It's not my decision. I edit the series. I don't publish the series. There's a big difference.
Sounds good. Well, Joseph, we are right at time. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure listening to you. You know, the information you shared is par excellence. You know, there's so many people that are valuing what you've said, and you've opened some obvious eyes to what is upon us in the world, right? With these wonderful works of literature and how they're being distorted, and how Ignatius Press is being a solution to that. So thank you again for that. I would only invite the audience at this point to join us for our next talk with Sherry Bloomquist. That happens in about half an hour. So we'd invite you to join us there, and also visit our vendor booth. There's a lot of wonderful booths out there, especially the Ignatius Press booth. As you can see, Maureen has put in the chat, there's a 25% discount right now at the conference on the goodie bag page. So check it out. So again, thank you, Joseph. It's been a pleasure seeing you again, my friend.
Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.
And everyone have a great afternoon, a great evening, and we'll see you at the next talk. God bless.